Hi, everybody. Welcome into another edition. This is Cross Functionality. Great to be here. The show connecting coaching, baseball, softball, male, female, hosted by former college baseball and softball players. Episode 46 today. We're talking about athletes taking responsibility. Plus, we have a listener interaction that we'll talk about as well. We'll get to that here in just a second. Let me bring in my friend, co-host, softball national champion at the University of Alabama and current day renowned coach, Cassie Riley Boscia. Cass, how are you today?
Doing great. Thank you.
Good to be here with you. As always, Athletes Taking Responsibility, episode 46. And the main thing we're going to be talking about today when you discuss athletes taking responsibility is that ownership. But let's get to that listener, I guess it's a listener question, right? This came to you from your Instagram account, at @coach_CassieRB on Instagram, at @CoachCassieRB on Twitter, at Jim Tara on both platforms as well. But this comes to your Instagram. And who was it from, by the way? Certain father, a player.
It seemed like a coach who coaches young athletes, and it didn't have a name actually. It was, you know how sometimes the name's blanket, it's just the @ handle. So
Sure. Yeah.
it was just the @ handle, and it wasn't a name in the @ handle either. So I will try to find the exact one, but I don't have it in front of me right this second.
All right, no worries. All right, here we go. A ton of young hitters are encouraged to bend their knees, which often gets them stuck in that upright position. Now, any suggestions on how to get into that hinge? Now, the question I have when you talk about bend the knees, is that in the stance or is that in the load? When does that part occur? And then we can get to the second part of the question. Any suggestions on how to get into that hinge in the swing?
Sure. So, I mean, we talked about this a little bit a few episodes ago. We had talked about some common misconceptions in hitting and how the hinge really is, there's two hinges that we can talk about. There's a hinge in the weight room where you have a barbell and you're going into an RDL or a deadlift. And then there's the hinge in hitting where we're really just trying to get out of our quad loaded position and get our chest into a little bit of a better position. Now, for younger, I'll go backwards actually. For elite hitters, you're going to see some hitters start in whatever stance position they want, essentially. And because they're such elite movers, we're mostly concerned about, can they get into that back hip hinged position where their chest is slightly forward as they're in their stride in their launch position, right? Because if they're kind of hanging out relaxed in their stance, we don't really worry about it. When we have a younger hitter who does not have as elite movement patterns, we don't want them having to worry about starting upright, having to get into the hinge. We really want to get them in what's called just an athletic position sooner rather than later. So many athletes will say, hey, go ahead in your stance, bend your knees. And what that does, like most hitters, they'll just shove their knees forward and they'll be in that position. And one of the best things for a young hitter, because granted, if you have older hitters, that's up to you how you want to coach them, what works best for them, right? But they're going to have a much greater range of cues that'll probably work for them because they just have more experience. A very young hitter who's starting out, one of the best things I heard was, hey, well, what does your fielding position look like? And nobody sits in their fielding position with their chest completely upright and their knees shoved forward. But we hit like that sometimes, or we try to hit like that. In your fielding position, they'll immediately go, oh, I'm here. And their chest will come forward, right? And they'll get in that ready stance. Or, hey, if they play basketball, what's your defensive stance look like? Boom, and they'll get in their defensive stance. And the hitting stance is really not that much different, if not maybe just a little less crouched, right? Like, so we put them in that defensive position and then we say, okay, here's your bat. Now get your hands up. And just the simple act of putting your hands up puts the chest in that right position. And it's been very, very effective for hitters to translate because, yeah, you're doing something athletic. You're just in an athletic stance. It doesn't necessarily have to be all that different.
Right. So when you talk about bending the knees, though, that starts the whole basis of this question. You're talking about bending the knees. How do you properly bend the knees? Do you pretend you bend them inward, pretending you're kind of squeezing a basketball between your thighs? That's what I was told once. Okay, analogy, it's not great. But how are you bending the knees? Or are you just saying, hey, get comfortable in bending the knees and then we can go from there?
Yeah, I really don't overly cue the inward action. And I get why. And the reason, it's like it's a tension-based thing. You're trying to get an athlete to feel maybe, okay, I'm about to have that load and try to not be, because you don't want them stepping flat-footed. It maybe keeps them on their toes a little bit more, whatever it may be. It's so many times with younger athletes, just observe how they normally move and what makes sense to them, because the more information we give them, sometimes the harder it is for their natural athletic ability to take over. And you do want it to be a natural athletic movement when they are hitting. So yes, it's a slight bend in the knee. It's the natural athletic movement. It's the ready stance. It's all those things, but it's a lot less of like the direct constraints on those younger hitters, because you really you want those natural movements to play out. And again, this is my opinion. There might be a coach out there that turns around and is like, well, listen, like this has worked really well for my younger hitters to tell them to pinch in, but I have a tendency to stay away from it because it seems to have messed up a lot of my younger hitters that I've worked with.
And I'm wondering how it messes up that quote unquote hinge or the load or getting into the back hip. If it does at all, it might not, but maybe it could. I'm not sure.
Yeah. So if we look at an elite hitter, and especially it's hard because it's not going to happen to every single. It's not going to be as obvious in every hitter. I should say that. But if you look at Major League Baseball hitter and you watch their back knee, and especially a hitter with a lot of mobility, and I'm going to try to. I'm not going to pull a name out of it because I can't think of an exact example right now that makes it very obvious. But the back knee, even if it starts in a little bit, as they go into their load, what happens is their hip is starting to coil around their back femur. So you're going to see an expression happen at the knee, and it's merely just because that femur is starting to rotate with that hip, but it's almost going to look like the back knee turns out towards the catcher a little bit before the hip starts to drive, and then it turns back in again. So that is we're not going to tell a little kid like, hey, listen, look at all this rotation that's happening at our femur and our pelvis. Like we want that to like happen very naturally if it can, and that might not be able to truly be expressed until they have some more muscle development and some more sequencing in their swing. But if we teach them at a young age, hey, you have to pinch in and we have to squeeze in, then that might never actually develop in them if they're really over exaggerating something like that.
Yeah. All right. Well, if anybody has any questions, a good hitting question right there, you could reach out to us on Instagram at Jim Tara, at Coach_CassieRB on Instagram, at Coach CassieRB on Twitter. I'm at Jim Tara on Twitter as well. Email us your questions, jimbopodcast21@gmail.com. Okay, episode 46 today of Cross Functionality, talking about athletes taking responsibility. And what a time to talk about this with the MLB draft that just passed. And I could tell you, and again, this is one of the reasons that I prefer college hitters being drafted very high over high school hitters, because college hitters understand better because they were in that team environment and they were in that collegiate environment for 3 to 4 years. They understand how to take responsibility better. You know this better than anybody, playing, of course, at Bama for 4 years, winning a national championship, taking ownership, taking responsibility. But a lot of those guys, those major league players that were drafted in the first, second, third rounds, maybe some high school hitters, but I'm leaning more towards college hitters. They all understand how to take that responsibility and take that ownership, which again, today, taking ownership, that's a big part, a big keyword in our episode.
Sure. I think anybody who's found success in any field, it's very rare you see someone at the top saying, well, yeah, it was so-and-so's fault why I didn't get here sooner. It was, they're always taking ownership of what they do. And I think something that I've used to talk to my athletes about a lot is everything in your life, whether you like it or not, it's going to be your fault. And, they sit back and they're like, well, no, not everything. And what I had said is that's the mentality you want to have. The mentality you have is that it's your fault, because it's not just that you're taking ownership of things when they go wrong. It's that when things go well and you accomplish great things, you say, yeah, that's my fault too. And there's especially with a female athlete who tends to defer compliments and tends to say, well, okay, it's everyone else is doing really well too, instead of, being like, yeah, I own that. I owned every process of it, the good, the bad, the ugly, and here's where I got to. It was very empowering for a lot of our athletes. And as coaches and as parents, if we can instill this in young athletes, we'll start to see this particular trait trickle into every other part of their life, schoolwork, friendships, relationships, whatever it may be. It's a very empowering trait to have.
Yeah, you talk about athletes all the time, and CEOs and heads of companies, whatever, they would want to hire an athlete. And a lot of times I think that's not just because their athletic traits, what they bring on and off the field, but their ability to take that responsibility and to take that ownership. What's that old saying? If an uncoachable athlete is an unemployable employee, something along the lines.
That's a Coach Murphy quote. That is a direct Coach Murphy quote.
Well, I mean, great. Like I said, great minds.
Uncoachable kids become unemployable adults.
Thank you. Yes, that's what it is.
Teach your kids to be coachable.
Yes. Yeah. And that's again, I think you learn that so much in a collegiate environment when you have great coaches like a Pat Murphy, for example, at the University of Alabama, countless college baseball coaches who have built miraculous programs in the past, I don't know, however many years, 10 years, last decade and a half. They're able to teach those athletes that ownership, which again, another reason why I prefer hitters at the collegiate level to be drafted very high in the Major League Baseball draft, because they understand how to take responsibility, but understanding too that ownership is a key component to that, and some smaller ways that we can look at how to take ownership, because it's not just, hey, I'm going to take ownership of this, or I'm going to take ownership of that. It's the smaller increments of taking ownership when you really don't want to.
Yeah, and I think this is something I learned. I would like to say I had bits and pieces of it in high school, just because I think very highly of my parents. I think they did a very good job, and I'm sure lots of people think they have great parents, but I have always thought very highly of how they did what they did, and I appreciated that. But it was almost like the bits and pieces I had were able to just grow so much more in college because of the support and I guess the teachings from that. But something as simple as, and honestly, this is even travel ball. My mom for a while was a single mom up until my mom and stepdad got married at 12. So I remember she looked at me and she goes, okay, this is your uniform. This is the washing machine. This is the dryer. If you want a clean uniform, I'm not going to have time. I'm at work all day, whatever else. And so she basically said, if you want a clean uniform, this is how to do it. Here are the tools to get it done. And now this is on you to do it. And then even when I got to travel ball, I remember they said, don't be asking your parents for water. Don't be asking your parents for Gatorade. Don't be asking them for snacks. If you want to have something to eat in between games or whatever, this is on you to get yourself ready and fueled and to be prepared during games. And the main reason they were telling us that was, hey, college coaches are looking for this and you're trying to be recruited right now. And it looks very young and it looks like you're lacking responsibility in parts of your life if you're yelling over to your parent like, hey, I need a blue Gatorade, go get it for me type thing, So that was always, hey, your equipment, your uniform, your food and drink, that's on you. And then I think even something as simple as, when we talk about younger kids, I see my younger cousin, she's just starting to get to travel ball. And I'm like, where are you playing this weekend? She's like, I don't know. It's like, she's very much so a passenger. But granted, this is the transition phase of a young kid starting to take ownership as an adult, or turning into more of an adult athlete, I guess, or a higher level athlete, where you're talking to your parents like, where are we going? How long is it going to take there? What do you need from me? What can I help with? This is my team. You're my family. How can I help this team move along? Because at the end of the day, your parents are taking you places for you. They're buying your equipment for you. They're doing these things for you. Yeah, let's take some ownership of getting yourself there as well.
Yeah, it's funny because a lot of times taking ownership is doing those passive type things that people will overlook, the little things. More and more I get older in life, I realize how important systems are, to have those systems in place. And you just gave a great example there of your mom showing you how to wash your uniform and when to wash your uniform, when to get it done, and then making sure that you are fueled correctly and making sure that you've got your drinks and you're hydrated. That's part of those systems that your mom created for you to help you take ownership and responsibility. And I think that may be what you brought up there in that story, that may be more important than just giving your kid lessons to a coach. It's understanding that your kid needs to take that ownership as well. It's not just on the field stuff. It's not just mechanics. It's not just fundamentals and the results on the field. It's also being able to take ownership as well. That's a huge component in successful athletes.
Gosh, absolutely. I've talked about it before. I had an opportunity to connect with the Pirates minor league coordinator back in the fall, and they were playing the Brooklyn Cyclones this past weekend. And the coordinator and two minor league coaches were able to stop by our facility, and we were just talking. And so many times we think like, oh, this is the Pirates. This is we're going to talk about elite programming, and what we really talked about was low hanging fruit for some of these athletes. And they had, for an example, they had a hitter. He was raised in the Dominican. He was taken out of school very, very early, around 12 years old, and basically just brought into a baseball academy to just do baseball. And so certain things that you take for granted maybe just were not learned or conceptualized, whatever it was. He made start making a lot of money, and it has all this talent, but was not performing well on the field at all. And so all they did was just talk with him, and they found out he was having a Mountain Dew at midnight. He was barely sleeping at night. He wasn't drinking or eating anything. He was barely drinking any water throughout a day, barely eating anything before a 12 o'clock game, and feeling like garbage come game time. And so they were like, okay, let's literally just take the Mountain Dew out of the equation, put a Whoop band on you, put something on you that measures your sleep. All we're going to tell you is we just want you to try to get this much sleep every night. And all of a sudden his performance takes off, and people are like, what are you doing in the weight room? What's his force plate numbers look like? What does his hitting program drills look like? And they're like, the same, actually the same. He's just taking a little more ownership of having himself be prepared to play for the game. So it's even at these highest levels of someone who signs for $2 million that is, these little tactics are still needed and still super necessary in order to, continue to climb out of that ladder.
Well, you mentioned there that he was put into a baseball academy at what, 14, 15 years old?
I think even younger, but yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So, I mean, maybe it's 12, 13 years old. And we've seen a lot of that throughout the years with these Dominican camps or academies, if you will, in the Dominican Republic. And a lot of Latin-born players are put at 12, 13 years old into these academies. Now, again, they're put into some sort of like a bubble at that point. Mm-hmm. So now I do wonder how, as an athlete, do you take ownership because you see it with basketball too, with AAU and both men's and women's. You see it with hockey. I have a cousin who played professional hockey, played in the Maple Leafs organization. He now plays overseas. He spent much of his childhood in that hockey type bubble. So we see it with all types of sports. How can athletes then learn to take ownership when they're inside of a bubble and all they know at that point is the world around them, which is their respective sport?
Right. Well, we see it even, everyone has like their own bubble, and it might just even be their normal school routine. I mean, athletes have very little autonomy, or really teenagers have very little autonomy sometimes, because it's, you wake up, you go to school, you get told exactly what to do. Here's what you learn. Here's what you read. Here's what you do. Go. And when you come home, it's like, go here, go to this lesson, do this, check this box, whatever, go home. And then at the end of the day, when you ask them like, well, hey, why are you doing this? Like, what's the purpose behind the lesson you just went to? Why are you doing anything that you're doing? They can't even answer those simple questions, because they're kind of just being shuttled along, being told what to do every step of the way. And then all of a sudden we want them to go to college and take ownership, or they get drafted, and then we tell them, hey, go take ownership of your day and your life. And it's like, I don't even know where to start with that. So it really sometimes might be like, at a young age, teaching a kid to even just, hey, night before your game. I do this with my stepson, who's 6 years old. He has to lay his soccer uniform out the night before a game. And that's super simple. It's not like he has to wash it, fold it, put it away, but he just has to lay it out the night before. And that's it. That's all we have to do. But it's at least a start, where my hope is, as we raise them, that they continue to take ownership if sports or whatever they decide to do in life, that it's theirs and they own it. And good that they own it, because they should. Again, it's not just that they own the hard parts of it, they own the amazing parts of it, right? And they can truly feel the benefit of accomplishment in your sport, which at the end of the day is like, not everyone's making it pro, such a tiny percent. Not everyone's going to college, again, such a tiny percent. So what's our main goal with so many of our athletes we work with? It's to have them feel that type of accomplishment at some point.
How do younger kids, younger athletes, how do they take ownership and stay on that track of the system that was developed for them, maybe by their parents or coaches? Because a lot of kids don't follow these types of rigid systems, and in turn, they don't really take ownership. So how can kids kind of stray away from the pack when it comes to that, but also be a really good teammate?
Right. Yeah. So you know what? I always think it's hard, because you are going to have to do things, every kid has this dream of like either making varsity, right? Even just making varsity. Well, how many kids actually make varsity out of who try out? 20 out of the 50, maybe, let's say. So it's like, and that's more for baseball. Sorry, I'm giving a softball example, but you have to ask yourself, or tell yourself, well, I need to do something very different than the majority of kids in my high school, because I'm going to be 20 out of however many that are in my high school. And then you put it on top, like, well, I want to go play for a travel organization. Great. You may think a lot of kids play travel ball, but it's not. So now again, you're having to say, okay, what am I doing different? Like, you can't just we can't have your daily life look exactly the same as everybody else and then expect your performance and results to then be different. So, and then forget it, college athlete, you really have to separate from your norm of who you're going to high school with most of the time. I'm not saying you have to be a hermit and never interact with people, but your daily life might look different. And when we got to college, we had a sign on a mirror that said, "What can I do to help my team today?" And it was so simple. And I know I've talked about this before on the podcast, but it was so profound and it had such a long lasting effect because you're getting dressed in the mirror in your uniform and it's what can I do for my team today? And so that remained on my mirror in a dry erase marker. And as I got older, I'm like, wait a second, my parents are a team. My Alabama team is my team. I have a group of friends that are very close with that. That is another team of mine. Now that I'm in a mom position, right? My family is my team. And I think that what starts to happen all of a sudden is when you have that mentality, let's say you make an error on a field, it's not like, oh, poor me. It's no, what can I do to help my team today? Because saying poor me and throwing a pity party right now is not helping my team right now. When another teammate strikes out, it's not, oh, they struck out, not my problem. Again, you constantly ask yourself, what can I do to help my teammate today? And they might not want a high five. They might not want a pat on the back, but you might the next day say, hey, I'm hitting extra. Do you want to come with me? Because in your head, you've got to know your teammate and you're like, that's what's best for the team right now. And you're taking ownership in a completely different realm. So sometimes just that simple question, having like that mantra of like, okay, how can I help my team? What can I do to make this situation better? What can I do to improve those around me and myself? That's a whole new level of ownership. And it's almost like a thesis statement for your life, right? That everything else and trickles down.
So when you're getting to higher levels, and this is very important for athletes, you want to be recruited for Division I, high-end Division I, Division II programs, coaches will look to see if you do take that ownership within a team environment. What are some things, some tips, advice that you may have for athletes in terms of taking ownership in a team environment? This is a smaller part of taking ownership, but it's very important nonetheless.
Yeah, and I think sometimes the direct examples are really helpful because I think everybody's heard of it, but then they might feel a little lost on exactly what it looks like, right? And so something goes wrong with you personally, right? I remember I was a junior in high school and my coach, one of my coaches I had, she was also coaching a athlete who was playing in a top 5 program. And so I was sitting there watching the game with her and we were talking and, this girl makes 2 errors at second base. And I remember thinking like, okay, like I was more intrigued on how she was going to handle it. Cause in my head, I'm like, this is a top 5 athlete, blah, blah, blah. And she came over and the first thing she said to our coach was, my coach just didn't hit me enough ground balls at this week at practice. And I was so shocked by it. And sure enough, like that girl didn't make it. She ended up not making it. She tried to transfer and didn't make it at that level. So I'm sitting there and I'm like, it's not because of those 2 errors. It's not because, everyone makes errors. It was because of the thought process behind it where there was zero ownership. It wasn't, I didn't go seek my coach out for ground balls. I didn't work extra on my own. It was someone else's fault. And so now when you displace blame for something that happens to you instead of looking inward, now you have in your head, there's nothing you can do about it. Because it's not even your fault. So why would you even try to do anything about it? Because in the first place, it wasn't even yours. So when something goes wrong, look inward. Okay, what can I do to help this situation better? Sure, maybe there was other confounding factors that impacted it that were in someone else's boat, but what can you do personally first? And then, so that's number one. Something goes wrong with you, you look inward. Something goes wrong with your team. Again, so whether that's a loss, you're in a bad inning where like 3 or 4 different errors have been made. A passive approach to not taking ownership again is just staying in your lane and being like, well, this is just, it wasn't my issue. I didn't strike out. I didn't make the error. No. What can you do to help your team today? That's looking inward. What can I do to help my teammates out? What can I do to help the situation? Taking responsibility. That's a leadership thing in a whole new realm. Yeah. And then lastly, so when there's fundamental issues that start to reoccur in your life, and things that look like is you're staying up later than you normally want to. You're missing workouts. You're eating routine is not where it needs to be. Just things are out of sync so many times. And this is honestly, I think this is sometimes more like when you see college athletes, like their grades maybe slip a little bit. It's like, well, I'm just so busy. My schedule is so packed, or I can't eat right because we're on the road all the time, or I'm not sleeping well because we're in different beds all the time. Those excuses are not incorrect. They are realities of your life. But the issue is that you're allowing them to dictate the result of your life, right? Instead of being like, okay, yeah, I know I'm on the road eating at these fast food places all the time, but why not sit down with a nutritionist or do a simple Google search on the most healthy options at these fast food places so I can maximize my nutrition? Why not figure out, okay, you know what? I'm not sleeping well because my roommate stays up and watches TV. I'm going to go get something for my eyes so I can go to sleep, earplugs and an eye mask. And now I'm going to try to sleep a little bit better. So again, these are just little examples of how your daily routine and habits can start to slip when we start to just allow the excuses to flow. And if anyone's interested in somebody who talks about ownership for a living, Jocko Willink is a former military personnel. He's written quite a few books, but his two main books I've really enjoyed were Extreme Ownership and then The Dichotomy of Leadership. And one of his quotes, and I had it on here, is once people stop making excuses, stop blaming others, and take ownership of everything in their lives, they are compelled to take action to solve their problems. And that's really what that's getting after. If we place blame on other things, we don't feel like we have any power to actually change anything going on. So looking into his podcasts and books, I think I would highly recommend if this is speaking to you.
Yeah, well, he's got a great podcast as well. I subscribe to it. And hey, if you haven't subscribed to Cross Functionality, please do so. We appreciate that. Apple, Google, Spotify, wherever you get your podcast. We're on Pandora and iHeart as well. And you could watch the show on YouTube, the Softball Strength Academy YouTube page, to watch previous episodes and to watch this episode as well. Again, new episodes every Wednesday at 9 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. So again, thank you for all the support. Leave a review as well. Let me play devil's advocate before we wrap up today's episode. I have to ask, because sometimes I think maybe if you take too much ownership, you don't always completely see reality. How can athletes split apart from, hey, this was my fault, I take ownership of this, but this was out of my control, this went wrong, this person did this to me? You kind of alluded to it earlier with the mindset, but how do you split the two? And it's like, sometimes it's like splitting hairs, but how do you split the two so that you don't completely become, for lack of a better term, delusional and taking too much ownership and then blaming yourself and then taking on that negative energy?
Sure. So I think the taking ownership is, I guess, the over-encompassing mentality that you have, because you don't even get to the question of, well, was this in my control, unless you took ownership first, right? So I guess you have the mentality that you're taking ownership of everything in your life, and then you're going, and then you get to this next thing. Let's say you're having you're in an at-bat, a pitch is at your eyeballs, and the umpire calls it a strike, right? It's so easy to turn around and be like, this guy sucks, and just turn around and be like, he's terrible. But you say, okay, umpire is out of, right, because you're taking ownership of the situation first. You're not displacing blame on a bad umpire, and you're saying, okay, what can I do to help the situation? The umpire is not in my control. What I can do is I'm expanding my zone just a little bit more. I'm protecting against anything that is possibly close, and I'm continuing to stay with my process, right? But we don't even get to those next steps of what we could possibly do with an umpire with a large zone if we don't say, well, this is on me now to find the solution. So I think that's really the delineating factor, is you're not going to take ownership and try to fix everything in your life. And that's almost like, that almost lends into like a little bit of anxiety ridden areas of your life, right? Where it's, you know, there's a meditation app that says anxiety is like standing on the side of the road and seeing all these bad thoughts and things going on in your life and trying to go on the road and stop the traffic. Whereas when you have a really good idea of what's in your control and what's not, you can stand on the side of the road, see these things going on, and just let them go by. And I think that's really kind of the difference, where if you're trying to take ownership or you're trying to over control every part of your life, you're in the road trying to stop traffic and stop all these things from happening or direct them exactly where to go. Taking ownership is just realizing you can get to that second question and then decide, okay, how do I go? What are my next most productive steps now?
By the way, just a random question. Where did you guys eat on the road when you were on the road at Bama?
So
Was it fast food joints? Where did you guys go to eat?
very
Decently healthy?
rarely, it was very rarely like your typical fast food that you think of, like
McDonald's, Burger King.
None of that stuff. And listen, we were very lucky to have a university with a larger budget when it came to certain things. So Friday nights before a series, we're always at some type of nicer restaurant. And then any other like lunch spots or anything like that, coach would try to bring us to Panera that had some more healthier options. There's something called McAllister's Deli down south, which is not as common in the north, but again, it was a similar as Panera type thing. But always, it was actually very cool. We had a nutritionist in my last 2 seasons with laminated little cards that said, listen, if you do end up at a Taco Bell, here's how you can order it. You can order something like Fresca style that has extra lettuce, extra tomatoes, whatever it may be. Or if you end up at a Wendy's, here's how you can get 2 servings of chili off the dollar menu and then a salad. And like, this is how much protein now you're getting. Because it's also, people think it's like, oh, the calories are bad, the fat is bad. It's like, for athletes, it's the lack of protein, it's the lack of nutrients that are really going to affect them the most, than it is necessarily like an increase in calories because it's fast food. So it's really just making sure that we hit the right nutrients and we were fueled enough for our performance, I guess.
That's one of the biggest things in life, I think, in general, is taking responsibility for, because everybody goes on a diet eventually in their life, right?
It's not restricting. Yeah, it shouldn't be restricting. I think that's the biggest misconception.
That's why diets are so popular and they sell, and you see these kind of fly-by-night workout type pieces of equipment that then eventually just go away. And some of the old school, like Louis Simmons, for example, Joe DeFranco, just to name a couple of trainers, Jim Smith, their principles and their teachings, they last the test of time. My point here, what I'm trying to say, is that one of the biggest parts of taking ownership in your life is your actual diet. And I always thank God that I got parents who never would allow my sister and me to drink soda at dinner. It was always from the time I can't even remember, from the time I was an only child, and then my sister came along. It was all, and they used to tell my babysitter Debbie, this all the time when I was an only child: do not let him have soda, because I would try, of course. It was either milk or water, no tea, nothing. It was always milk or water. That was it. And sometimes if it wasn't milk or water and it was a treat, it would be, say, like an iced tea. Mm-hmm. Never soda, rarely fast food. I mean, never McDonald's, never Burger King. It was never the fast food chain. And I think that habit of not, I guess, the eating habits that I had to grow. I haven't eaten fast food since 2018. The last fast food place that I went to was Steak and Shake. But I haven't eaten fast, and I don't want to eat it now, and I didn't really want to eat it back then. I haven't drank soda, an actual real soda, since 2017. So my point is, when you develop those habits, one of the biggest things in life is the dieting part, and I hate using that word, but it's eating healthy and establishing that. If you're a parent listening, for your athletes, young kids, establishing that early on. My parents did it. Cass, I'm sure your mom did it as well. And taking ownership of your eating habits, that's very important as well. Because oftentimes, you mentioned it there, the athletes, it's not the fast food, it's the nutrients that they're not getting, right, the protein they're not getting. You don't take ownership of what you're eating, that's fuel right there, and you're really doing yourself a disservice.
100%. I couldn't agree more.
Yeah. All right, well, next week, episode 46, talking about achieving higher levels of success. How do we go about that? Well, one of the ways we do that is by taking ownership, which was today's topic, athletes taking responsibility, but athletes achieving higher levels of success. You know all about that, having gone on to the pinnacle of collegiate softball, winning the national championship. That is the pinnacle, no matter what team you play, although playing at Bama's pretty good feather in your cap, so we'll be talking about that next week. Can't wait to unlock some of your secrets.
Well, I think it's a lot of what we've, the sprinkles of what we've discussed, but it's also, I've talked about it too, defining that higher level of success, because it's going to be very different for different people.
Yeah. So that's next week. Thank you for listening. Be sure to subscribe. If you have any questions, email us, dreambowpodcast21@gmail.com.